Picture this. It is 11 at night. There is a desk, a simple one, the kind with a coffee ring from last week still faintly visible in the corner. On it, a textbook with 3 colours of highlighter, 17 sticky notes, a notebook so full of underlines it looks almost like art, and a student who cannot remember a single thing. Not because they didn't work, they worked for hours. They read every page, they read some pages 3 times. And yet right now, if you ask them to reconstruct one clear idea from memory, just one, the mind returns something close to silence. That feeling, that specific hollow stillness after all that effort, is not a failure of intelligence. It is the inevitable result of a method that was never designed to work. Japanese students aren't studying more than you. They have simply discovered that the brain has a hidden gear, one most people spend their entire lives never shifting into. Stay with this until the end, and you won't just walk away with a technique. You'll walk away with a mental architecture that makes forgetting genuinely difficult. In 2008, psychologists Jeffrey Karpicke and Henry Roediger III at Washington University in St. Louis published a study in the journal Science titled "The Critical Importance of Retrieval for Learning." They divided students into groups. One group repeatedly studied the same material. Another group studied it once, then spent the remaining time testing themselves, with no notes, no prompts, no safety net. 1 week later, the self-testing group remembered 80% of the material. The repeated study group remembered 36%, not slightly more than double. The broken equation that most of us inherited from school is this, that hours of rereading equal depth of memory. But what the data shows, quietly, consistently, across more than a century of memory research, is that the brain does not store what it is shown. It stores what it is forced to reach for. Familiarity and retrievability feel identical in the moment. That is the trap. Comfort fades, retrieval lasts. Japanese school culture understood something about this long before the science had language to describe it. That understanding is built into 3 concepts, layered in increasing depth. The first begins not with what you study, but with how completely you arrive at it. Walk into a Japanese elementary school classroom. In the minutes before a lesson begins, you will notice something that is almost uncomfortable in its quietness. Students clear their desks completely. 1 notebook, 1 pencil. The kind of stillness that feels arranged, not accidental. A pencil placed parallel to the edge of the desk, a small breath taken together before the teacher speaks. This is not aesthetic. This is architecture. The concept is called Shūchūryoku, Jijong-le. It translates roughly as the power of gathered focus. Jijong, Shūchū, meaning convergence, the act of pulling scattered things toward a single point, and Li, Ryoku, meaning force. Not attention as a soft suggestion. Attention as a directed force. The neuroscience behind this is precise. When information enters the brain under conditions of divided attention, a phone nearby, a background conversation, a half-formed thought about something else, the hippocampus encodes it shallowly. The trace is thin. It requires far more repetitions to consolidate, and it fades much faster under the pressure of time. But when that same information arrives, under conditions of full cognitive presence, the encoding is structurally different. Deeper, more connected to surrounding knowledge. The brain does not need to see it as many times because it was met with sufficient weight the first time. Shūchūryoku is not a productivity tip. It is a biological prerequisite. Every additional minute of distracted studying is not neutral. It is actively producing memories that are fragile by design. The Japanese classroom understands this not as philosophy, but as daily practice. Stillness before learning is not ceremony, it is calibration. But arriving fully is only the first layer. What happens after the lesson ends? What a student does in the quiet that follows determines whether anything encoded in that hour will survive the week. There is a practice at Toyota that many outside Japan find surprising. When a project is completed, not when it fails, when it succeeds, the team gathers for what is called a Hansei Kai. a reflection meeting. The goal is not celebration and it is not blame. The goal is an honest inventory of what was understood, what was assumed, and what would happen if it were tested again, right now. The concept is Hansei, Fan Sheng. The character Fan, Han, means to reverse or turn back. The character Sheng, Sei, means to examine, to inspect. Together they describe not regret, but a deliberate turning of the gaze inward, to see clearly what remains and what is already gone. In Japanese schools, children practice Hansei daily, not as a punishment, as a diagnostic. What did I actually absorb today? What am I uncertain of? What would I get wrong if someone asked me right now, with the book closed? That last question is what makes Hansei a memory tool, rather than a reflection exercise. Because the moment a student asks, what would I get wrong, and then attempts to answer from memory, they have initiated exactly the mechanism that Karpicke and Roediger's research identified as the engine of retention, retrieval without prompting, the act of reaching for something before being asked to reach for it. This is the gap that most studying never crosses, the space between exposure and honest self-confrontation. Reading a page twice fills that gap with a feeling of familiarity. Hansei fills it with actual knowledge. The practical tactic is simple enough to begin tonight. After any period of study, before closing a notebook, before moving to the next subject, take 4 minutes. No notes. Ask yourself what you just absorbed. Write it from memory, not to be graded, not to be correct, just to find out what is actually there. What you cannot write, you do not yet know. And now you know where to return. Shūchūryoku determines the quality of what enters. Hansei determines whether it stays. But both of these are still skills, still techniques, still things you do. The deepest layer of the Japanese method is not something you do at all. It is something you become. In the 16th century, a Japanese tea master named Sen no Rikyu wrote a poem. The line that matters goes roughly like this. Keep the rules entirely, break them, depart from them, and in all of this, never forget the origin. From this idea, a concept took shape that would travel across disciplines, from the tea ceremony to the martial arts, from pottery to medicine, to the way Japanese students understand what it means to truly know something. The concept is Shuhari, Shu, Po, Li. 3 characters, 3 stages, an entire philosophy of how knowledge moves from the mind into the bones. Shu, Shu, means to protect, to follow. In this first stage, a student receives a method completely, without filtering, without modification. Not because they are told to be obedient, but because the structure must be absorbed before it can be understood. This is the stage of deliberate, precise repetition. The stage where you do not yet have enough knowledge to know which rules are essential and which are provisional. So you follow all of them, fully, the way you would trace a master's brushstroke before attempting your own. Ha! Po! Means to break. Once the foundation is stable, truly stable, not just familiar, the student begins to question it, to test the edges, to experiment with what holds and what bends. This is not rebellion. This is the first sign that the method has been genuinely absorbed. You can only break a rule intelligently when you understand why it exists. Re-li means to depart, and this is where the research and the philosophy arrive at the same place, from very different directions. When Karpicke and Roediger measured what happened after repeated retrieval practice, they weren't just measuring memory, they were watching something become structural. The neural pathways that encode a fact through repeated retrieval are not the same pathways that encode it through repeated reading. Retrieval-based memory is woven into associative networks. It connects to related knowledge, to context, to meaning. It becomes, in the language of neuroscience, schematic. Part of the architecture of thought rather than a note pinned to the wall of it. This is ROI. This is what sticks forever actually means. Not that you remember the information, the way you remember a phone number by holding it carefully in place, but that you have become someone for whom that information is simply part of how you think. The way a fluent speaker does not translate, they express. The way a skilled musician does not recall the scale, they inhabit it. Aikido master Endo Shiro described the re-stage as arriving at a place where we act in accordance with what our heart and mind desire, unhindered, while not overstepping the laws. That is not the description of memorization. That is the description of identity-level knowledge, the kind that does not erode between semesters, the kind that shows up intact 5 years later in a room where you least expected to need it, offered naturally, without effort, as though it were always yours. That is what the Japanese method is building toward. Not retention, ownership. So here is where it becomes real. Tonight, after the next thing you read, the next lecture you finish, the next chapter you close, before you put it down, take 4 minutes. Sit with a blank page. Write what you know in your own words from nothing. Not everything, just whatever actually made it in. That 4-minute gap between receiving and retrieving is where the entire method lives. It is the moment when Shūchūryoku's depth of encoding is either confirmed or lost. It is Hansei making the invisible visible. And over time, repeated with patience, not urgency, not pressure, just quiet consistency, it becomes the beginning of Shuhari, the beginning of knowledge that no longer requires a test to survive. The version of you 5 years from now will not remember every hour you studied, but they will carry, effortlessly, the things you forced yourself to reach for. That is not a small thing. If someone in your life is studying hard and still forgetting, someone who is working and wondering why it isn't working, perhaps this conversation belongs in front of them, not as advice, just as a quiet observation they haven't encountered yet. This video is a journey into cognitive science and learning philosophy, not academic prescription. Every mind is different, and the most important experiment is always the one you run on yourself.